I landed in New York City for a journalist assignment in 1986, and it was one of those eureka moments that I just felt the moment I hit the ground that I wanted to live in this place. And that was from somebody who'd grown up in London and always thought London was the greatest place on earth, and had a kind of inherent sort of prejudice, not necessarily against New York City, certainly it was instilled in us in our generation against America. And I landed in New York and I was like, I just want to live here, and it took me 18 months to figure it out. And interestingly enough, at the start of the book, somebody who was much, much younger than me when he first came, but the book opens in 1927 with a character called Mario Bowser, who was really instrumental in modern music. There would be no Afro-Cuban jazz without him. The mambo would not have sounded the same, bebop would not have sounded the same. He came to New York at the age of 16 in the spring of 1927, at the peak of the jazz age, the peak of the Harlem Renaissance. He was with an orchestra from Havana. He was a prodigy, clarinet prodigy, but he was dark-skinned. And in Havana, in Cuba, there was literally a caste system, and if you were dark-skinned as opposed to light-skinned, you were not going to be able to ever lead an orchestra. And he came to Harlem and realized that, you know, you actually you could have dark skin and be an enormous success in New York.
Each of my chapters in this book is a different culture, a different genre, a different neighborhood. And there have been books about each of these individual items, such as punk, such as folk, such as bebop. And I hadn't read a book that had tried to link these together, and people really tend to think that each of these music forms exists in a vacuum, and people will tell you that punk rock was a reaction to disco, when in fact, if you listen to Blondie and the Talking Heads, you realize that actually it was just a rock form of disco. The two things were going on concurrently. At the same time, hip-hop was not a reaction to disco. Hip-hop was black kids in the Bronx doing their own version of disco, and that's just how it came out and how it ended up sounding. The Ravens lacked a bit of gospel. The person who came along and really added that to the music was a guy called Clyde McPhatter. He was from North Carolina, but grew up in Harlem. He was from a church family. He was secular himself. He gave a great quote about doubt and religion, that it seemed to be just a matter of form of discipline. One day he said to his dad, you know, God damn it, and his dad beat him. And I think after that he started singing secular music. And Clyde McPhatter had one of the most amazing voices. When he entered the Apollo's amateur night, he won it instantly. He was hooked up with Billy Ward. The group was originally called Accused, and it was called the Dominoes. And very, very quickly really turned the music on its head, because their first single was called Do Something For Me, and it really added a sense of gospel. The next record was 60-Minute Man, and a lot of us know that as one of the rock and roll classics. I kind of make the point in the book that there's actually a sense of sort of novelty to it that's maybe not really the true to form for the Dominoes, and really for what we would like out of R&B. And I wanted to play a clip. 60-Minute Man was the biggest R&B record of 1951. What I'm going to play now, Have Mercy Baby, was actually the second biggest R&B record of 1952. And if you think of what you just heard from the Ravens, now you'll really hear how the music has changed in just 3 years. You were not allowed on the dance floor of the Palladium unless you were going to dance. I mean, you would literally be told to get off the dance floor if you weren't dancing. And there were 3 orchestras really held their own at the Palladium Ballroom. This is the first of them. This picture was taken prior to the Palladium era. Machito and his... here they're named the Rumba Kings, but as the note underneath actually says, it was Machito and his Afro-Cubans. Calling themselves the Afro-Cubans was really quite a big political step. It was really saying, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, at a very early point. But the group is a New York City group, despite the name. Machito emigrated from Cuba. The trumpet player, second from right in the back row, is his brother-in-law, Mario Bowser. I use his story to open the book. Without Mario Bowser, bebop would not have happened the way it did. Afro-Cuban jazz would not have happened the way it did. The guy was one of the most influential characters in music, and I don't have time to tell his story, but Machito was the front man. At the back there, to the left of Machito, is Tito Puente, all of 18, 19 years old. He is about to go off to war, where he spends 3 years at war in the Pacific. He fights in no less than 9 battles, earns himself a presidential commendation. And when he comes back from war, he is hoping to regain his job in the Machito Orchestra. The GI Bill actually says that you can get your old job back. He finds out that his replacement has 5 children, says, well, I'm not going to do that, uses the GI Bill to finance lessons at Juilliard instead.
You know, I have to say, by the way, being in London, you know, we really thought the Ramones were like, I mean, we thought it was so scary, and you know, we were giving I don't mean me personally, but we were giving the world the Sex Pistols, who I think were genuinely scary. But I for better or for worse, spent a lot of time on the football terraces, and all the older kids in 1976, for some other reason, I was kind of adopted by a group of kids about 3 years older than me who caused a lot of trouble and used to keep me out of it. But they were all massively into the Ramones from day one. Like in 1976, they got that first album and they were just there for life. And we looked up to the Ramones, or we viewed the Ramones as being like this incredibly scary street gang. And yet something I found, and there is some truth to that, I guess, I mean, Dee Dee didn't have an easy childhood, and Johnny was, clearly a tough guy, and Jeff as well, Joey Ramone didn't, and you came from Hungary in the Revolution, didn't have an easy time. But there's something that I got when researching the book that, people try to make out that the Ramones, with doing your 1.5 minute songs at CB's, sort of didn't know what you were doing. Like somehow there was an incompetence. I mean, it's completely the opposite, isn't it? It's like you knew exactly what you were doing. This was like art, right?
One of the things that it was kind of cool is that LP comes out in December '77. It's like all these other acts have made their LPs that year. I like using the word LP, by the way. I'm deliberately using it.
Now you're telling everybody how old you are now.
No, I'm deliberate because, that's what they were. They were long players. They were two-sided records.
12 by 12. Nice
big deal. And, Ramones had made 3 by the end of '77. I think Blondie had made a couple. But it's like Suicide, if you think of '77 as the big year, which I do, and I think a lot of people do, you squeezed in under the wire. The band that was there in 1971 squeezes in and makes this record, and gets it out in December '77. And I think I wrote that there, and I stick by it. I think it's every bit as influential as those other records, Marquee Moon, Horses,
maybe more so.
Yeah,
you never know; it's still going on.
Yeah, and those the track. Just to get back to this, but the tracks, with the exception of Frankie Teardrop, listen to that Suicide LP. It's synth pop. It's not what you would imagine Clash fans having to like riot, or especially Elvis Costello fans of all people, having to like bottle you off the stage for. It sounds like the blueprint for synth pop of the '80s. This is Blondie on stage in 1977 at a benefit for Punk magazine. That's Fred Smith on bass. He'd been part of their original lineup with the Stilettos and then with the early Blondie. He'd left them for television, left them in the lurch. Clearly they finally made up and made friends because he's joining them on stage. And the final picture is a nice way to leave this. That's Hilly Crystal outside the club in 1977. You can see he's now got a line outside his club. You're not seeing mohawks or punk rock haircuts or anything. It's a downtown scene. It's people of all kind of, it's just a downtown scene, but I think you can see a pretty proud bar owner, club owner by that point. I had some other music that I'm not totally sure we need to play, but it's worth mentioning, or maybe we'll play it as I finish up. As early as 1975, when they did their first demos, Blondie demoed not just the Shangri-La's song Out in the Streets, and not just a song called Platinum Blonde, but they also demoed a song called, at that point, Once I Had a Love, which they also used to call the disco song, and it was about 4 years later that it became known as Heart of Glass. And I mention that because I actually thought, as a kid in Britain who was like any other kid in Britain in love with Debbie Harry, I thought they kind of sold out to disco in the late 70s. So it was instructive to know that they had written that song and they were playing it at CBGB's. It's also worth knowing that the CBGB's jukebox had the Hughes Corporation and Gladys Knight and the Pips on the jukebox. I want to make this point as I wrap things up. All these scenes are fascinating in their own right, but when you pick up a book on punk rock and it only talks about CBGB's and it only talks about white bands, rock bands, long-haired, machismo kind of bands, you're missing a big part of what is going on. You're missing the fact that there's a disco scene going on. You're missing the connection to Max's. You're missing the connection to the avant-garde, the connection to the minimalism. The Ramones understood all this stuff. The Ramones, no wonder Andy Warhol ended up coming down to CBGB's. The Ramones were minimalism, at its most minimalist. People are obsessed with this idea that the factory is going to happen again, says the 26-year-old DC native. But it's gone. That's what's great about New York. It's forever changing, and there's always someone new. And then she says, people like to say New York is dead, especially if they've lived through one period and have seen another one arise. But it's like, come on, man, you've just been living here longer. Thank you.